I just want to say that it's my pleasure to speak in front of this audience today. I know it can be hard to break away from projects and meetings, and so I just want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us. I've been very excited to share some new ideas and techniques with you, and so I'm going to try my best to make it worth your time. And if you're just interested in the consulting industry or currently working in consulting or just curious, I've put something in this presentation for you. So my overall intention is to give you a new perspective on how case interviews work and how they can work for you. So I think a good place to start today is just talking about, what is our goal? What is the goal of everyone here on this call and who's watching this presentation? My goal is to help you learn the kinds of skills to crack case interviews that are taught at top MBA programs around the world. And so you might be asking yourself, okay, great, so how are we going to actually do this? And so, as you probably know by now, the best way to learn anything is just to try it. So we're going to make that easy for you today as we move step by step through each question. And just like a standard case interview, this interview will have several types of questions. At the beginning of each question, at the beginning of each section, I'm going to speak out the main question. And this is where you can just put yourself in the driver's seat of the case interview and listen to the question and write down any important details that you hear. Then I'm going to give you a little bit of time, say 30 seconds, to take down some notes at the end of each question. Finally, after you've taken a bit of time to write down some thoughts or speak out a potential response, I'll move into a short discussion talk. And here I'll list the main principles that apply to each type of question. And these are the techniques that you should learn to do well in your next case interview. Finally, I'll share with you a sample response that combines some of the best approaches that I've heard from candidates over time. So after all that discussion, I'll open it up to your questions. And I really urge you to treat this as the most important part of the webinar because with a good question you can fill in any of the gaps that I left out, probably because I just forgot to mention something. And if you ask a question, that'll help me think, oh wow, I should really mention that next time. So please feel free and don't hold back. So the next portion of this presentation, I just want to tell you a little bit about my background because we talked about kind of our main goal, and I want you to make sure that you're getting the best advice. So just up until last year, I was working as a management consultant with McKinsey and Company. And life as a consultant is kind of unique because you're usually juggling a few things at a time. You've got your client work, and on the other hand, you're trying to help run the overall consulting firm. And so you might find yourself at a consulting firm pitching in on recruiting or writing white papers or doing client development work and so on and so forth. And so I'm sure there are people on this call who are consulting industry veterans who sort of know what I mean. Anyway, so I ended up getting involved with recruiting because I just really enjoyed the people aspect of it. So I sort of gravitated towards doing candidate interviews, and I really, really enjoyed them. It's just, it was fascinating to meet so many talented people at really exciting points in their career, and so that entire process was just very exciting to me. So when I decided to leave consulting and spend more time locally with my family, I started giving consulting career coaching sessions over Skype to friends of friends and friends of the family and things like that for free. And as you can imagine, one thing kind of led to another, and people started contacting me. So I decided to open up a career coaching firm, The Case Coach, where you can find me at thecasecoach.com. Now, through this business, I've gotten to meet clients from all walks of life, all over the world. I've worked with first and second year MBA students, practicing medical physicians, research scientists, experienced consultants. And since I work through Skype, it's pretty cool because my clients are based in places like Bangkok, New York, London, Cairo, Moscow, which is always kind of neat. So people sometimes ask, why do you go into coaching? And honestly, what I would have to say is that one of the best parts of this job is when you get an email from a client saying that they got the job, because that's really what gives you a spark as a coach that you just live for. And so my clients have moved on to roles at all the major consulting firms, including McKinsey, Bain and Company, Boston Consulting Group, Accenture, Deloitte, and several other boutiques. Now, on a final note, I just want to mention that I also teach career development and business communication to undergraduate students in my capacity as an adjunct professor at the USC Marshall School of Business. The reason why I mention it is because that kind of work lets me see how different industries treat incoming talent differently, and so you can just imagine how different an advertising resume can be from a consulting resume. And so I pretty much live and breathe in this career development space, if it wasn't already blatantly obvious. Why don't we move forward and talk about why is it important to learning case interviews? And so for most people the quick answer is, well, okay, to work as a strategy professional. If you're the intellectually curious type, strategy can be a fascinating career that gives you access to a ton of hard problems. Your research and recommendations can have pretty far-reaching implications for a business, an organization, a product, and not even to mention your customers. Strategy professionals routinely get to facilitate communication to top management, which itself is a fascinating process and can help accelerate your career. So even if you don't want to be a strategy professional, chances are you will eventually come across one someday. And this webinar will help you start to speak their language and maybe even influence their recommendations. Many folks come across consultants in their everyday work. In fact, there may even be a consulting team working down the hall in your office right now. There's also been quite a trend towards more and more internal strategy groups starting up by ex-consultants working in-house at major Fortune 500 corporations. Finally, the great thing about case interviews is that they can help you think strategically. So if you're starting or thinking of starting a new business, this can help you decide what is your value proposition, who are your customers, and what is your cost structure, and address those questions in a strategic way as opposed to an organic or instinctive way, and just give you another tool to add to your toolkit and complement your existing skills. Great. So we've talked about why you might want to learn case interviews. The next thing we want to talk about is what are people actually looking for in a case interview in candidates, so you can kind of help or start to crack that code. So the first thing case interviews are notorious for is that they're going to test you on your quantitative ability. So if you remember the math sections on the GMAT, the SAT, or the GRE, the good news is that the case interview math is definitely easier than what you're going to find on those tests. The only difference is that you're going to be performing math calculations in front of someone, which can feel a little bit strange. And what I've observed is the most common math question I've seen is something called a market sizing question, where an interviewer might ask you, well, how big is the market for coffee tumblers? And so you might be expected to kind of walk through a few different estimates and calculations and make some assumptions based on demographics or average purchase size or purchases per year, maybe the average price of a tumbler, that sort of thing. And they're really just looking to see if you can take a vague and unstructured problem and break it into digestible pieces and use good business judgment. The other type of math you will find, and that you will find today, is one based on some data that is actually given to you. And so your interviewer might just ask you to assess the data and calculate something important from it. And here, you'll have to soak in some new and potentially conflicting information. The key is to find the most important pieces and build a calculation. And that's really what you want to keep in mind is you want to drive towards an accurate answer. Now, the second thing that's just as important to consultants as math is structured analytical thinking. And so a favorite technique that consultants like to use is something called MISI thinking. MISI stands for mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. And consultants like to use this approach when they break down a business problem. So if you were asked to analyze the book publishing industry, you might start by saying, okay, well, how would you break down the book publishing industry? Well, we could break it into products, and we'll break it into ebooks, paperbacks, and hardcovers, where each addresses a different customer segment. And this is kind of a short example of an exhaustive list of the different aspects of the book industry that are non-overlapping, which makes them mutually exclusive. So MISI thinking is important, as a strategy professional, because it allows you to, break down these problems into distinct portions, but also address all problems and questions that might arise in a holistic manner. So in a case interview, the most common place where you're going to be tested for me-see thinking is typically at the start of the case, where you're asked a question like, how would you approach this problem? Finally, the last type of skill that case interviewers are going to be looking for is your creativity. And I like to say your MacGyver skills here, because you might be asked to think of new ideas for new products, new ways to sell your product, and a host of other things. So what your interviewers are looking for is, given a structured approach to a problem, within those structures, within those pieces, can you demonstrate breakthrough creativity and come to meaningful insights? Now, these kinds of questions can come up at any point during your interview, and so we'll review a question list just like this in the case itself. Now, in terms of we've talked about the questions. Now, in terms of the formats of case interviews, these can vary across all consulting firms, even interviewers within consulting firms, and internal strategy groups. This can be a somewhat esoteric thing, but there are different ways to research the formats. A great source that I recommend candidates use is Glassdoor.com. There's often reviews of interviewing processes across different firms, and you can start to get a sense of generally what to expect. So the biggest distinction that you should know is that of the candidate-led interview and the interviewer-led interview. In the interviewer-led format, you encounter a series of questions and have time to process and address each one. In a candidate-led format, you might receive an initial question and quite a bit of open space in how you solve it. So you might hear a question like, our client's thinking of opening a new factory in China. Should they do it? And you'll be expected to talk and ask questions and come to a conclusion within about a half hour. Sometimes your interviewer has some critical information that they can share, but they'll only share it if you, earn it, so to speak. Secondly, some formats you're going to see are not just a one-on-one interview, but a group-style case interview. So a consulting firm may place you in a group setting where you're given some specialized data on a work stream and expected to work with others to come up with an overall recommendation. Here, you're going to be observed not only in how you solve the problem, but also whether you play well with others. However, just given the constraints of the webinar format discussion, we're just going to focus on the one-on-one style interview for today. So just to recap, today we'll be doing an interviewer-led case interview in a one-on-one format. The next thing you might want to think about if you're preparing for a case interview is, well, what's the topic going to be like? How do I prepare for the right topics? And there are several people who work in the career development space in consulting who are just as passionate about this stuff as me. And one of these people is J.P. Martins, who's the head of consulting careers at the London Business School. It's the top ranked MBA program in the world. And he runs a blog called problemsolve.org with lots of good advice for MBA candidates who are interested in consulting. Anyway, he and his team have analyzed the case interview questions that their students have received. And they've gotten a pretty cool view on what sorts of strategy questions are making their way into case interviews. And it turns out that case interview topics haven't really changed that much over time. Broadly speaking, the two main types of questions that you're going to see are how do we grow revenues and how do we improve profitability? There are many reasons for this, but the most important reason is that you can kind of imagine that these are the two questions that are going to be at the top of any CEO's mind. You might also find a number of other questions in a case interview, such as, how do you respond to an industry shock, or how would you implement a particular solution, or should you acquire a competitor? But what this all means to you is, as a case interview candidate, if you really want to maximize your preparation time, my advice is that you should just practice simple, straightforward case interviews around growth and profitability. So I'll be helping you do so today with a case that involves revenue growth. Great. So with all that background, we're finally going to get to today's case. We're going to review a case that I call Bentham Technologies, after the social theorist, Jeremy Bentham. The topic involves an unmanned, remotely piloted aircraft or drone. And this case is ideal for preparing you for an interviewer-led case interview. Finally, first, one reason why I like this case is that it really separates some of the kinds of questions that you will see in your case interview. I've also given this case a number of times to clients in the past, so I've gotten the chance to observe, what kind of responses are really distinct, and whether the candidates who do well in this type of question will also kind of go on and do well in their actual case interviews. One of the challenges that candidates often find is that sometimes it can be very difficult to find practice case interviews if they've got a case interview coming up and they want to practice. And so what I like to do is I just like to read all the materials that I can find, from what's out there and published to what's passed around across business schools. And I found that there's just a lot of consulting clubs that publish really great cases for their members to practice. And I've adapted this case from the Keller Consulting Club's 2010 casebook after a case named Dark Sky. Dark Sky sounds kind of foreboding, doesn't it? So on this next slide, this is basically going to be kind of like a roadmap for the case, and we're going to be covering, let's look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces of an interviewer-led case interview. First, I'm just going to say the question. Next, you just feel free to write down any notes or speak out your response. Then we'll move on to kind of discussion, sample answer, and questions. Finally, we're just going to return to this roadmap and fill it out throughout the discussion so that you have all the main points in your notes kind of in one easy place. So your first challenge in a case interview is going to be, how do you even gather your thoughts when you're given a complex and novel question? And the solution that I suggest to you is to really scope or determine the dimensions of the problem appropriately. So after I ask this question, you might ask yourself, how would I scope this problem? So here's the question. Our client, Bentham Technologies, I'll just call them Bentham, is a small manufacturer of unmanned, remotely piloted data collection aircraft based in Sunnyvale, California. Bentham has a single product called the Skyvisor. It's an unmanned aircraft that was originally designed for unmanned weather exploration. In 2003, the U.S. military began purchasing Skyvisors for use in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions. Recently, Skyvisor sales have leveled off, and Jeremy Bentham, the client CEO, has approached our consulting firm to help determine the ways that the company can grow its top-line revenue. So I'll just pause for a few moments as I put this question up on the screen, just for you to gather your thoughts and read the question and potentially speak out a response. Great. So, the first thing you want to do when you get a question like this is, and hopefully you've gotten a chance to kind of read through the question and think about how you might respond. The first thing that you want to do is really restate the question in your own words. And this is going to help you in a couple of different ways. First, it's going to help you confirm that you've understood the problem. It's also going to highlight anything that you missed. And so if there's anything that's unclear in the initial question, now is definitely the time to think about it or to ask about it. So if you don't think you understand the business model, or maybe there's some key terminology that you don't understand, then a question here could go a long way in helping you just do better overall. Finally, you might ask whether there are any time or financial objectives. And what I mean by this is there a time frame by which the client is trying to grow revenues? Is there a specific financial target? This will help you use these as criteria for the options that you encounter during the course of the case. So here I'm just going to speak through a sample response to this introduction. Okay, so let's see here. Our client's name is Bentham Technologies. Bentham manufactures small unmanned aircraft. They've been selling them to the U.S. military, and recently their sales have leveled off, and now they'd like to grow revenues. Is that right? Okay, then I just have a couple of questions to help me understand. First, is the U.S. military their only customer? And second, are there any financial objectives or time-based objectives we might meet? Finally, would you explain what is an unmanned aircraft? Great. So while we normally would take questions at this point, the next question is an analytical style question, and it's very closely tied to this one. So with your permission, I'm just going to go ahead and move to the next portion of the interview. So our next question is the analytical style question that you often hear right at the beginning of the case interview, right after you've heard kind of the introductory information. It often goes something like, how would you approach this problem? And I really want you to think about the discussion about McKinsey that we just had earlier in the presentation. So the question is going to go something like this. How should the client approach the problem of growing their top-line revenues? And here, I'll just pause for a few moments to allow you to gather your thoughts and write down or speak out any potential responses. Great. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of time to write down some ideas. There are a few things that I'd like to discuss for a question like this that is analytical in nature, and a few tips that can help you in your case interview. So first, you remember what we talked about with me-see thinking, and whenever you get a question like, how would you approach this in a me-see kind of way? Luckily for growth problems, there are several revenue frameworks that can apply. The first of those is called the revenue tree, which sort of deconstructs the concept of revenue into its component parts, the price of a unit and the number of units sold. So you can just kind of think of these as your two levers to increase a company's revenue. So one way to think about this is, if you were on a consulting project, then you might have one member of your team working on pricing, determining whether there's any pricing improvement potential in a particular product or set of products for a company. Now the other lever that's quite powerful is to sell more units of your product. And so, you might do this through, in this case, more effective bidding for U.S. military contracts, expanding your market to other countries, etc. Now together, these two components will fully address the revenue issue. However, I like the revenue tree, but as time has passed, I've kind of observed more and more candidates defaulting to using it. And so other candidates have begun using a more sophisticated approach, which I really like. Some candidates frame their discussion around customers and products. And so one way to think about this is with a tool that I call the Ansoff matrix, after Mr. Ansoff, a noted management scholar. Just think of it as a 2x2 matrix where the horizontal axis represents products and the vertical axis represents markets or customers. And on each axis, just put a little label on that says new and existing. So you've got new and existing on the bottom and new existing kind of going vertically. I don't have it in front of me on this screen, but you might be able to do that kind of on your own. So what you'll end up with is a 2x2 map of all your potential revenue opportunities, and you can apply that to any business anywhere. It's actually pretty neat. So for existing products and existing markets, you would be, in that space, you'd be talking about market penetration if you wanted to grow revenues. If you were selling existing products in new markets, then that would be market expansion. But what if you're developing new products for your existing customers? That's more like traditional product development. So you think about Windows XP to Windows 7, there's probably something in between that I missed there. Traditional product development. Then finally, if you're developing new products for new customers, that's what strategists typically call diversification. And that's how, Walt Disney can move from theme parks to movies and back. So if all this sounds kind of confusing, that's okay. I will be using this matrix later in the sample answer to kind of give you an example of what it looks like. So the third and final thing that you might consider in a growth case is applying the concept of organic and inorganic growth. So organic growth is basically the growth that you see in the Ansoff matrix. That is, growth that originates from the company itself. Inorganic growth typically comes from things like deals. So some examples of these would be an acquisition of another firm, which would increase your top-line revenue by the amount of revenue that your target firm currently receives. Another example is a licensing deal, where your client might license out some portion of its technology for a fee and allow a third party to develop it. Finally, there's a joint venture where company A and company B can together start company C and share the proceeds. So that's a lot of words on the topic of growth. The final word on this is that though all of these approaches are different, each could be considered me-see in their own way. That is, mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. You could potentially say that out of all of these, the inorganic-organic split is probably the most comprehensive, which is why I like to use it for questions like this one. So if you were to bring that all together in a nice, neat answer for your interviewer, here's what it might sound like. Okay, great. So since our goal is top-line growth, we might think about this in terms of organic and inorganic growth, and I'll just address each separately. Now, on the organic side, let's think about this in terms of our customers and products. So for our existing product, the SkyVisor, can we sell more to the U.S. military? Maybe we engage in more contract bids or just develop a better understanding of the bidding process. Next, can we find other customers for the SkyVisor? So we might look at other allied countries of the U.S. who require the same technology. We might even just look at high conflict regions around the world and determine whether the nearby countries or governments would be interested in this technology. All of this would, of course, depend on what regulations or contractual obligations would limit us into selling this technology to other markets and customers. On the other hand, we might look at whether it's possible to develop new products and services. So if we don't already have a maintenance revenue line, we might think of launching it, starting with the Army bases that are using our product. And you mentioned that there are several competitors in this space. I wonder if we could create some spare parts for their drones, as I'm sure that these are machines with mechanical parts that occasionally break down. Finally, we might even expand our option set to true diversification. So is there a customer out there who we haven't thought of who might be able to use this technology in a way that we didn't even intend? We basically sell flying drones with the ability to gather information. So I'm sure that we could adapt our technology somehow where some software firms could make better and more accurate maps. Now, outside of the organic realm, we could look at inorganic growth. So is there an acquisition candidate who would be a good fit and help us increase our overall top-line revenue number? We might also license out our technology to a startup with a new idea. Finally, I just wonder if there's room for a joint venture with another outside company on a new, more consumer-oriented technology. So to recap, it looks like we talked about inorganic and more traditional growth. And under traditional growth, we've covered selling more to the U.S., selling SkyVisors to other countries, developing new products for the U.S. government, and just developing products for completely unimagined customers. Excuse me. And on the inorganic side, we kind of covered potential acquisitions, licensing, and joint ventures. Yep, I think that covers it. Great. So that was a little bit of a mouthful, and thank you for listening to all of that. But that's what a good answer might sound like. And so, for a lot of people, that explanation happens pretty fast. So I just want to kind of pause here to see if anyone would like to ask any questions.
Sure, sure, of course. So we actually have a few questions. One actually Rahul had a question. What about increasing price?
That's a great point, Rahul. And actually, it's something that I didn't include in my overall discussion. And so it's something you definitely want to include when you're talking to a case interview. Oftentimes, price is one aspect of a revenue problem that is oftentimes, you can mention it, but there's often not a whole lot of room there. But great point.
Gotcha, gotcha. What if actually George has a question? What if during the interview he made a mistake and wants to take it back? Is that possible?
Yeah, of course. So if you feel like you made a mistake, then my advice to you in a case interview is just to call it. Take a step back and say, you know what, I don't know if this totally makes sense. Let me think about a different way to approach this, or let me adjust this a little bit. It would be better to do that, or to say that, so that your interviewer has a more complete perspective on sort of the perspective that you're bringing, rather than a perspective that you think is incorrect.
Mm-hmm. Great. Also, Andrea had a question. What about regulatory or legal constraints?
Great question. Definitely something that you could briefly talk about at the beginning of a case interview, but regulatory and legal constraints, and we sort of mentioned that with selling this product to other customers. You may want to briefly mention it at that point, but I do say be careful about going down too far down that road, because you don't want to get lost in sort of the nuances and the details. It's a really good thing that you've even highlighted it, but since you have only about 45 seconds to a minute to give your answer, you may not want to spend too much time on it.
Gotcha, gotcha. So another question we had is, how strict are interviewers when it comes to sticking to time constraints?
Yeah, it all depends on what's going on that day. and I don't mean to be flip, right? But when you're actually interviewing candidates, you also are typically on a client project of some sort, and you try to get everything done before Friday, where oftentimes you have candidates coming to the office to do interviews, but sometimes you can have live things going on at the same time, and so I always try to clear my deck and everything when I went to an interview, but things can happen and you can kind of get into a rush, and so that's kind of a long-winded way of saying that it really depends on your interviewer. Some of them will try to stick to time constraints and use their time effectively because they're going to see, they just have to see so many candidates that day. Others might have, a more open schedule and just kind of be more relaxed. So you should try to feel that out once you're speaking to the person, just to kind of understand, what's going on with their day and how things are going from their perspective.
Gotcha, gotcha. Actually, a related question about time from Carlos. How much time can one take to plan the answer before speaking?
Yeah, and that really depends on the person who's interviewing you in the firm. But that's really a great question. No consulting firm is going to expect you to come up with a brilliant answer on the spot on a question that you've never heard before in your life. And so it's totally normal, and I would even say usual, for candidates to take anywhere between 30 seconds and a minute just to gather their thoughts and write down a good structure to talk the interviewer through. So if you were to take say 45 seconds, I would say that's completely normal.
Mm-hmm. Perfect, perfect. And do you have time for another question, or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. Priscilla asked, how can we know when it is a case we're supposed to ask for more data on, like for example past revenue, cost, etc.?
Great question. So there's two things you can know. You can either know before you go into an interview, where you do a little bit of research on the firm itself to kind of get a sense of what kinds of case interviews they like to ask. On the other side, you might just want to ask right off the bat, is there any other further information that we can research before we develop an approach to this problem? So you might, and it might actually even be a trial and error process where you say, well, I'd love to learn about some financial data. Do we have any financial data? Your interviewer might just say, no, we don't have any further information. Then you'll get a hint pretty quickly that this is more of an interviewer-led style. Now, of course, you don't want to find yourself in that situation where you just discover it's interviewer-led style when you're actually in the interview itself, and so you might just want to do a little bit of research. Places like Glassdoor.com, or if you're in a consulting club, talk to other club members, or maybe do a little bit of research on Google to find out what are the preferred methods of interviewing for the company that you're about to interview. Even another source may be the recruiter themselves who you're contacted, who's your sort of main point of contact, who, they're typically very happy to help you kind of manage the stress and anxiety of the process of going through a case interview.
Great, great. Well, those are the questions we have so far, unless anybody else has any last-minute questions for now. But that's what we have so far.
Great. Okay, thank you guys. Just continue, please, asking me as many questions as come to mind. Those were all really great questions. So in our next portion, we're going to talk about the creative thinking style questions. And so a question like this is really going to push you on thinking kind of outside the box within the confines of your case interview. And so it might sound something like this. Okay, so you've mapped out a great analytical framework for us to work with on this case. And so now we're planning to meet with the VP of Marketing for this client shortly. And she's asked us to set up a brainstorming workshop with other key executives to think about other applications for this company's technology. Since you did so well in setting up the framework for this engagement, I just wanted to invite you to take a look at this new problem. So the question is, knowing what we currently know about the product, what might be some alternative applications for the technology? And so I'll just pause for a few moments right now just to help you kind of gather your thoughts. Great. Hopefully that gave you enough time to put down some ideas. Creativity is a black box, and if I knew the secret recipe to it, I'd be on a beach in Maui. But since I don't, I'm just going to share with you a couple of things that I've observed candidates use successfully in the past. First, it might make sense to check if you can just relax the constraints to brainstorming. So what this means is, open your mind to ideas that seem impractical, strange, or unusual, that don't necessarily need a business case built around them. Because if you can, then you can open up a lot of new possibilities for yourself to look good and to perform well in the case interview. So I'll show you what I mean kind of during the sample answer. Then on a second note, I've observed folks who have decomposed the technology or the product itself into separate components or user benefits. And so this kind of gives you another avenue to breaking down a problem in a creative way. Here, the main aspects of the device are that it can fly, it can visualize objects on the ground via surveillance, it can also take some measurements about the weather. That's all you know so far. So, you might decompose the product itself into those three separate benefits and think of some creative ideas for product applications around those benefits alone. So I'll show you what I mean by that in the sample answer. So now that I've showed you kind of the main points of discussion, let's move to the sample answer. Here's what it might sound like. Okay, so there are a few aspects to this technology that I currently know about. First, I know it can fly. So I wonder, what are the boundaries of this and where can we take it? If we go higher, we might potentially be able to collect atmospheric data or even data about other satellites that are in the air. If it could go lower, say 100 feet above the ground, maybe there's a whole host of consumer applications to use it for. I could imagine a floating camera, floating over a football stadium in an aircraft to kind of help with instant replay. It's kind of ridiculous, but hey, maybe it could happen. On another matter, the sky visor can clearly visualize things. So as long as there's a need for visualization, you might think of a lot of different customers, as well as consumer and commercial applications. For example, I might imagine this could be a fun toy for luxury and high-end clients, sort of like a little spy camera for the super rich. There might even be a real estate application in there somewhere to help you take pictures of large or mountainous properties. Finally, I'm sure there could be some kind of government and scientific application. So if I were, a scientific researcher in a rainforest or in Antarctica, this might work a little bit like an advanced scout to scope out a new area. And of course, you can imagine a government and law enforcement application for this, right? Maybe drones could help the police catch bad guys or help with border surveillance, that sort of thing. Great. So for a lot of people, that explanation probably sounded pretty fast. I just want to pause here to see if there are any questions.
So actually not on this particular one, but we did have a question that came in over email, and it is, well, I guess more about general interviewing. How does one sell himself to an interviewer? How does he make him understand that there's so much more to come from him?
That's a really great question, and probably beyond the scope of what I could answer fully in this webinar. I will say that there are a few things that your interviewers are always going to be looking for. That's quantitative ability and judgment, analytical thinking, and creative thinking, and that really sort of tracks the case interview process and side of things. And so you can actually think of that as your opportunity to demonstrate all the great things about yourself. And this process is just kind of a brief training session to kind of get you up to speed. The other aspect that, of course, you want to demonstrate in an interview that just lasts an hour typically is your personality. And what consulting firms really look for there are your leadership skills, your interpersonal skills, and your experiences. And there's a whole approach to sort of thinking about questions like that. But ultimately, I think the answer to this person's question is you just want to be yourself, and you want to put your best foot forward. And so think of this webinar as helping you put your best foot forward in the case interview portion of the interview itself.
Perfect, perfect. And we definitely have a few more that came in. And also I want to just tell everybody that this webinar will run a little bit longer. We have until 8 p.m. Eastern, so please ask as many questions as you want. That's totally fine. We scheduled a little bit extra time just in case. Also, we have a question, does the brainstorming need to be put in context of potential customers, or is it typically more freeform?
Yeah, it kind of depends. Depends on what you hear in the question. It's a great question. And so every question is going to be different. And so you may not get kind of a standard brainstorming question, but when you hear words like brainstorming, new ideas, in the question itself, then it's sort of like a cue where you can assume that the constraints are relaxed. If, on the other hand, your interviewer expects you to think of specific customers and products, they probably will say that right up front. And if you're unsure, you should just ask.
Mm-hmm. Great, great. Also, another question, a question from JD. How off the wall can your creative ideas be?
Honestly, I think that the more off the wall, the better, because it's kind of a stressful situation, and your interviewer has most likely just talked to a lot of people that day, and so they're tired, you're stressed, and a good off the wall idea can really break the ice and make things kind of fun. So I've seen candidates talk about making this an underwater vehicle, make it a space vehicle. I like the sort of spy toy for rich people. I heard that from someone. I thought that was really funny and made me laugh out loud. And anything that can kind of loosen things up is usually a good thing in an interview. And so I would just suggest that you throw in a few off-the-wall ideas to kind of spice things up. That'd be great.
Perfect, perfect. No, it definitely definitely is. Another question from we have a question from Carlos. For example, can you talk a little more about the brainstorming session itself? How to lead the session, lend structure to the process, etc.
Sure. That's going to be, Carlos, just kind of unique for you and unique for anyone who kind of goes into this process, because creativity is such a difficult thing to kind of describe and teach, and it really comes to everyone differently and at different times. And so part of your challenge is going to be just understanding how you think creatively and how you can guide someone through. And so the one thing I did in this particular answer was separate out the device into a few different benefits. You might decide to make it more free-flowing and then just talk about what comes to mind. You might separate it out into consumer and commercial applications. And you asked something really interesting, which is how you lead the session. Depending on kind of your setting, you might be able to just do it on paper in front of your interviewer. If you have a whiteboard, you might even get up and go to the whiteboard and start using some markers and engaging your interviewer into that process. Of course, don't forget this is an interview, and this is going to be you leading and driving that process. So don't over-rely on your interviewer to give you ideas. It's really going to come back to your own.
Great, great. Well, those are the questions we have so far. So
those are great questions. Thank you, guys.
Perfect.
Yeah, no, great. So yeah, we'll move on to the next question, and we'll have another couple spots that you guys can, that everyone in this webinar can continue to ask questions that come to mind. So the next question is more of a kind of quantitative oriented question. And if you remember from the beginning of the webinar, there are a few different styles of quantitative questions. And we're going to be doing a figures-based question. Sorry, a figure-based question. So you're going to be receiving kind of an exhibit with a bunch of different numbers, and you're going to have to figure out what to do really fast. So just as a heads up, you might want to have a pen and paper kind of handy for this next question. Oops. There we go. So at this point in the case, we're going to switch gears and share some information that we've heard from Bentham Technologies' R&D department. It looks like Bentham Technologies has developed several prototypes designed specifically for military missions. Unfortunately, their manufacturing capability is limited, and so the company only has the capacity to continue producing the Skyvisor and only one new aircraft. The first device we learned about is the water visor, which was designed for Navy and sea operations, and they estimate it can be sold to the Navy for $220,000 per aircraft. There is also the land visor, which is specifically designed for high-intensity land operations, and it looks like the Army could purchase this for $210,000 per aircraft. Finally, there's a product that they are developing called the Ultravisor. And though its name sounds kind of pretty impressive, it's designed as a compromise for Army and Navy operations, and it can be sold to either service for a little bit less than those products we just discussed, at around $180,000 per aircraft. Now, one wrinkle we're seeing is the potential cannibalization of the Skyvisor. So the client has assembled its marketing team and concluded that the water visor could cannibalize up to 40% of the sales of the Skyvisor. The land visor could cannibalize up to 70% of the sales of the Skyvisor. And finally, the Ultravisor, being so well adapted to the needs of both the Army and the Navy, could cannibalize around 90% of the expected sales of the Skyvisor. So kind of given all that information I just shared with you, here is kind of a figure with all that information. In addition, there's some information on the forecast demand for each plane. So you see the Navy, it looks like they would like 45. The Army would like 65. And they'd both like a whole lot of the Ultravisors. So the question you'd see in an interview after receiving this information is, what is the revenue maximizing option for the client? And so I'll just pause for a few moments to help you gather your thoughts and think about how you might approach this problem. Okay, great. So this is just one monster of a math problem, and so the first thing you want to do in that kind of situation is really just figure out what is going on. And here, what's happening is that the company has one line of products called the Skyvisor, and it can produce one more, and it's trying to decide which one to produce, taking into account the effects of cannibalization. So you should just test that understanding with your interviewer themselves to be sure. Once you've done that, you might want to set up some sort of equation to confirm, what it is you've actually heard, right? So in this case, you actually will be setting up around 6 equations. 3 are going to be covering the new products and how much new revenue you could gain from each of those. 3 others will also cover the Skyvisor and how much incremental revenue you can expect, kind of assuming the cannibalization of this product. Then, once you set up your equations or your problem-solving approach, it just kind of makes sense to solve some of this stuff out loud. And so, that kind of gives you the advantage of being able to check your approach a second time with your interviewer. And if you're lucky, they might even just try to help you through the math. So I've got all my discussion points right here. And now that we've talked about these different aspects of how you approach kind of a quantitative problem, let me just give you a sample of what it might sound like. Okay, so first let's think about this in terms of the SkyVisor's revenue. What will it be if we don't produce another product? And what will it be under each scenario of new products? So if we just proceed with the status quo, then we're going to have 50 units of the SkyVisor that will sell for $110,000 each, which will get us to around $5.5 million. And by the way, this is another equation that you had to set up, but you got this from the previous exhibit. If we go with the water visor, then I'll just note that the water visor is expected to cannibalize 40% of SkyVisor sales. So the SkyVisor sales will be 100% minus 40% or 60% of 5.5 million, or around 3.3 million. If we produce the land visor, then I'll just note that the land visor is going to cannibalize 70% of SkyVisor sales. So the SkyVisor sales will be 100% minus 70% or 30% of 5.5 million, which equals about 1.65 million. And by the way, you'll have time to kind of write this down and figure these out when you're in the interview itself. I'm just speeding this up for your own benefit. So finally, if we develop the ultravisor, then I'll note that there's a 90% cannibalization rate of SkyVisor sales. So, for the SkyVisor, we'll see 100% minus 90% or 10% of 5.5 million, which equals about $550,000. So next, let's just talk about the expected revenue of each product. We spoke about the water visor and how the Navy is interested in buying, let's see, 45 units at around $220,000 each. So the quick math on that is $9.9 million. There's a product called the land visor, which we expect to sell 65 units of for $210,000 each. It looks like that total is going to be around $13.65 million. And again, you'll have time to calculate this out during your interview itself. Finally, we have the ultravisor, which would sell for a combined, let's see, sell around 85 units at $180,000 each. So that's going to be a total of $15.3 million. And just kind of bringing that all together, for the SkyVisor, we can only expect to sell around $5.5 million, since that's all we're going to produce if we just choose the SkyVisor. Now, if we produce the water visor, we'll have sales of $9.9 million and 3.3, which should get us 13.2. If we sell the land visor, we'll have sales of 1.65 million and 13.65 million, or 15.3 million. And finally, if we produce the ultravisor, we'll sell $550,000 of the SkyVisor and $15.3 million of the ultravisor for a total of around $15.85 million. So all in all, if the client is looking for top-line growth, then the answer among its new products is to go with the ultravisor. Okay, now that was a little bit of a mouthful. So that was unintentional, I promise. If you have any questions about that process, please just feel free to ask them now.
Sure. Actually, we have a question from Priscilla. Are we expected to do each calculation in our minds, or is it all right to actually write out the multiplication, since it seems like we need exact answers and not just estimations?
No, Priscilla, that's a great question. Are not expected to do it all in your minds, just like I sort of showed on the presentation. The expectation is that you'll be able to do this on kind of pen and paper. The other part of your question is whether you can round and make estimates, and that's certainly an option to you. My only advice to you is just to check it with your interviewer, because some math questions are actually testing to see whether you can get to the right answer in kind of a high pressure situation. And so if you round too much, you might get way off, and you don't want to put yourself in that position if you just didn't know whether or not you could round.
Perfect. Actually, that answered some of the follow-up questions as well. But we have some other questions. Is it possible to combine equations with SkyVisor and a new product, or is it not recommended?
Oh, no, you can certainly do so. I chose kind of probably the most laborious way to determining the output of this, the answer here. But if you can think of a better equation, then just go ahead and do it. I suggest that you try to decompose at some level so that, in a situation like this, you might be feeling a little bit of, being rushed because you're just trying to get to the answer. And oftentimes, candidates' accuracy can go down when they're feeling rushed. And so if you break it into little pieces and kind of talk them through, that can have the unintended effect of increasing your accuracy. But obviously, go with what works for you to get you to the right answer as fast as possible.
Mm-hmm. Great. Great. We also have a question from Christine. In this type of scenario, would we need to take into consideration capital costs or IRR on the investment? Or is it, sorry?
Yeah.
Oh,
No,
sorry.
please.
It's a little bit of a mouthful as well, but or is it something we don't do because it's only top-line growth? If we went with the ultravisor, I'd be concerned that we built up capacity for only one type of product, SkyVisor, and how much investment will we need to make to develop the Ultra?
So this is a really good question, and I'm glad you asked it. This sort of highlights the suspended reality that you find yourself in a case interview, particularly an interviewer-led interview, where the question's sort of already framed for you, and all that really sophisticated thinking that the audience member just provided to us, unfortunately, is sort of discounted at the question at the very beginning. Now, on the other hand, you can raise these issues, and this actually may be quite interesting for your interviewer to hear because it'll just show a different way of thinking. And that you're thinking about a broad number of issues. And I think that every one of the issues that you highlighted is exactly spot on and actually very intelligent, and that you should talk about these in your interview, particularly if you're in a candidate-led interview. But once you get the signal that, no, we're not really going to look at IRR, or no, we're not going to really look at investment costs, we're just going to look at this data here, then that's the signal to kind of just go ahead and proceed without any sort of external variables.
Great, great. That's a very good answer. I just had a question from Abhishek. With more number of units to produce, won't the cost of manufacturing also go up? And how to take that into account?
Yeah, that's another really great question. So what this comes back to is ultimately the question of profitability. And if I understand you, Abhishek, with more units, you're going to have more per unit cost, and so your total costs will go up. So one sort of hidden thing in this question is whether or not the chosen option is actually the most profitable one. Now, since it didn't mention that in the question, that's not like your top line answer. Your top line answer is really around which option provides the most revenue. But as a caveat, or even as a secondary part of your answer, you might say, well, the next thing I'd like to look at is profitability, so we make sure that we are recommending the most profitable option for the client.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. Actually, Wade pointed out something similar. I think he also focused a little bit about top line, but basically we focused on the webinar so far on the top line, but the bottom line also at least warrants a mention. He mentioned 80 units at 15,000 plus versus 90 units about 15,800, so gross. So I think he also brought up a similar point too.
Great. Mm-hmm. I mean, great points. Great points all around. And actually, you'll see in the next sample answer how we kind of address the profitability issue. But I'm glad that those were raised.
Perfect. Great. Well, that's all I have for now.
Okay. Cool. So let's move on to the last part of the case interview, where you're usually going to see kind of a closing style question. And if you've gotten this far, then you should be glad to know that you're pretty much in the home stretch. This is kind of the time where your interviewer might be checking his clock or thinking about his next hamburger or something like that. So just a word on closing questions. Consulting firms like to ask these questions to get you to kind of summarize the case at odd and inconvenient times. And it's really just their way of teasing out, whether you can take a step back and see the forest for the trees. And if you can do so, can you think of a few next steps? And if you can do that, then you're going to be fine. So what the question might sound like would be something like this. Okay, so we're going to get ready for an interim progress review with the board of Bentham Technologies. Would you like to take a shot at developing what the overall story and perspective is so far? So I'll just give you a few seconds to think about what you might say. Great. So if you've got a little bit of stage fright at this point, it's completely normal. It's hard to think of the entire case in one sitting, but what I've observed works best is the following. First, if you can just come back to the original question. So why are you here? And once you can just kind of acknowledge that, then it's easier for your answer to follow in a logical sequence. Once you do that, lead with your recommendation, and then just be sure to provide any appropriate backup. If you've got risks that you think you should deal with, then highlight them there. And finally, if you can think of any next steps, just like Abhishek recommended, looking at profitability, then definitely speak about those there where you can kind of push the project forward. So what does this kind of look like, when you're actually trying to give a sample response? Let me just allow me to share what this might sound like. Okay, so we've covered a number of things in this case, so let me just kind of take a step back. We came here to look at the client and to help them solve their problem of growing top-line revenue. And it looks like the emerging answer appears to be that they should advance a product they have in development called the Ultravisor. We determined this by assessing the revenue potential of each product and their cannibalization rates against the existing Bentham product, the Skyvisor. We also determined that the top-line revenue potential for next year is just a little under $16 million. We also looked into a number of new product ideas, including consumer and commercial applications, but those may be more of a long-term plan for the company to look at because we haven't learned anything about any of those types of applications currently in development. In terms of next steps, the client might try to understand a couple of things. First, what is the profitability of each of these options? Clearly, they're going to be concerned about that sooner or later. Second, I wonder what investment of time and money would be necessary to upgrade our ability to manufacture these devices. It seems like the demand is there, but we're also facing a constraint of supply. And so anything we can do there could also ultimately help the client grow their top-line revenue. Great. So I'll just kind of pause here again to see if anyone has any questions.
Great. But also just to remind everybody that we are recording the webinar, and we'll actually be sending a recording afterwards. And if you have any questions about the actual slide deck, I believe Nevin will have his contact information at the end. So please feel free to reach out to him because there were actually a few great questions about that. So just wanted to make sure that's addressed. And also, please write in specific questions so far because I'm still waiting for questions for this part. So I guess we don't have any questions right now, so I guess we can move on.
Okay, cool. Well, if you have any questions at all, just don't hesitate to let us know by email or otherwise, even at the end of this call or at the end of this workshop. Mm-hmm. So, guys, we've covered a number of different questions, and I just want to thank you for joining me today for that. I also just want to thank you for allowing me to speak with you, and if you have any further questions, you can visit me at thecasecoach.com or email me at nevcam@thecasecoach.com. And it would just be my pleasure to help you on your own journey into the field of consulting, whether it's brainstorming your career strategy or just taking you through a mock interview. I also want to thank the entire Ivy Exec team in helping me in the preparation of this webinar, and I want to give special thanks to you, Maciek, for moderating today and doing all the behind-the-scenes work that people might not see, but that's critical to the event's success.
Great, thank you so much, and it's definitely a pleasure having you on board as well. But definitely we actually have a lot of 20 extra minutes, so we'll answer as many questions as you have, for Nevin. Because definitely this was a very information-packed. So please, if you want, please send us right now over the questions box any questions about the material that he covered, or just in general the interviewing, case interviewing as well. We'll cover that right now if you'd like, and I'm sure Nevin will be happy to.
I'll put up kind of the final diagram of all the skills that we learned today.
Mm-hmm. Great. It seems that it was great that we actually, I guess, approached the high questions throughout the webinar, because it's feels like we've addressed a lot of them. Um, but actually now there are coming in. So thank you
Okay.
guys for writing in because we do have some extra time. So Andrea writes a great presentation. How do you convince a firm that your industry experience is valuable enough? Sorry, actually, more questions came in. Sorry. So valuable enough, valuable even though you don't have consulting expertise and may not generate immediate revenue.
Yeah, I mean that's a really great question. There are probably a number of different ways to answer that, but my suggestion for you, Andrea, is to work with someone or think about how to present and sort of structure your own experiences to closely match what consultants do on a day-to-day basis. And so if you were to do that, you would start to think, okay, well, consultants do a lot of problem solving of unstructured problems, and they structure problems on the fly continuously. So any projects that you've done where you've tackled some big, hairy, unstructured problem, you really want to highlight in your CV and your resume, your cover letter, and every communication you have with the consulting firm as you're trying to kind of get their attention. The other aspect that they're really looking for is leadership. And so any teams that you've managed, particularly through, high intense or crisis situations, maybe crisis is a little bit strong word, but teams that you've managed and led in your own career is something that you should continue to highlight. And I think finally the last thing that consulting firms like to look for is something that kind of just sets you apart. And so maybe that is industry experience. Maybe that's something else that just doesn't come to mind to me right now because I'm not looking at your resume. But anything to kind of push you over the top to make you, to help show you to be kind of a distinct candidate is something that consulting firms like, frankly, because they can then show that to their potential clients of people who are going to be working on projects for them. So if if you're an Olympic gold medalist, or if you've won some sort of innovation award or scientific challenge, if you've won any kind of award at all that's unique and potentially relevant, you should mention that there too. I hope that answers your question.
Perfect. And we definitely had many more questions come in afterwards. So, for example, one question is, do cases tend to differ for PhD candidates versus MBAs?
Actually, no. At least in my experience, they don't. And that's because the cases, in their most pure form, really try to test types of thinking that will be common across all backgrounds and skill sets. And so I think that they've, a lot of consulting firms have really done their best anyway to take out prior knowledge. Now that being said, what's true for one consulting firm may be very different for another. And what I've observed anyway is that although McKinsey has sort of led the way in what they call APD hiring, which is advanced professional degree hiring, and they've done so by developing an interview approach that is more kind of holistic and something of that nature. Other consulting firms, which are smaller and typically run by former MBAs, will have a different case interview. Business concepts may be more helpful. Again, a long-winded way of saying that for some firms, the case interview will be exactly the same for an MBA and a PhD. For other firms, it will be the same, but an MBA will have a distinct advantage over a PhD.
Gotcha. Robbie asks, as far as the conclusion, how long or short or detailed should we make it?
I mean, great question. I think that anytime that you're, talking through an answer in a case interview, a minute is usually a good kind of rule of thumb. I mean, you don't want to talk on and on and on and on, but at the same time, you don't want to be too short either. And I think that if anything, as I've observed, with people that I've worked with and candidates and things, the folks who they don't put everything sort of on the table, or they leave something on the table rather, are the ones that you wonder, could they have pushed you further or made it even more positive impression? And I think on the last question, if anything, you might err on the side of going a little bit longer than what may seem comfortable, simply because that's your sort of last impression, and it would be great to share a really kind of thoughtful and sophisticated answer in your last impression that you share with your interviewer before they sort of start to form an opinion of what this was like for them.
Gotcha. Actually, we have a few questions that revolve around practice. And for example, Jonathan asks, what might be good strategies for improving the quant skills needed to succeed in an interview? Also, what are the best way to practice if you don't have a partner? And is there a rule of thumb of how many cases you should practice before the interview, and how much time should you take before? So those are very similar. So I just kind of jumbled them together.
Right. No, so I'm going to write down quants, practice, and then
how many cases and time should you do before the interview?
Yeah. So this is a very good question, and there are some. So let's just address the quant practice question first. There are a number of different sites out there that allow you to practice your math skills. Some of them for free. So one of the free ones that I suggest to folks that I work with is something called caseinterviewmath.com. That's a good site that just has a number of math problems you can just kind of cycle through. Another site that I've seen people use is Numerical Guru, and I don't think that that's free. That may be paid. So, but that's also got a lot of really good math-style questions. You can always, go into a bookstore and open up a GMAT math section, although that may be a little bit high. That should give you a fair amount of, like kind of starter list. But let me continue thinking about that because it's a great question, and people always ask it, but I always kind of don't have the answer on the top of my fingers outside of those few things. But the other question is how many cases that you should practice before a case interview. This, in my view, is a direct function of how experienced the partner you work with actually is. And so if you're practicing with someone else who may be kind of a novice to going through case interviews, you might end up needing to practice more just so you get more feedback from that person. But if for some reason you have someone in your social circle or friends and family circle that is a consultant or a former consultant, you'll find that a couple of practice sessions with them will go a long way compared to just a friend who's also doing a case interview, because they'll be able to give you very specific feedback on what they observed, both from an industry perspective and also just from having interviewed candidates in the past. Finally, if you work with an interview coach or a case coach, that sort of thing, I tend to limit my work with clients to around 4 or 5 sessions, simply because I try to do very high impact sessions and give my clients time between sessions that they can work on certain skills. And so if you work with a coach, going over 5 sessions, unless you're a PhD with really no business background whatsoever, is probably, in my view, a little bit too much. So that's just might be kind of a rule of thumb that you use in your own preparation.
Gotcha. Great answers, and thank you for tackling all of them. So we actually have more questions. So what type of cases are presented during phone interviews?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, you're going to see very similar questions to the kinds of questions that we went through today. So you're going to get, unstructured business problems, always, where you're going to need to apply some analytical thinking to kind of break it down into a manageable part. I say always, but hey, there might be the 1% that isn't in that category. You also frequently will need to apply some creative thinking skills. So trying to break down new concepts and think of problems in kind of fresh ways that might happen even during the phone interview or maybe at the very end of it, where you've come to an answer and then they want to push you a little bit further to continue fleshing out your kind of creative thinking skills. Sometimes on phone interviews it's a little bit harder to do quantitative thinking style questions just because you don't have the opportunity to kind of share the numbers with the candidate. But in that case, you might see a market sizing question kind of more common because the candidate doesn't really need to have numbers in front of them. They just break down kind of an unstructured business problem with their own mathematical skills, and they kind of talk you through it.
Perfect. Can you talk about any differences between what is expected from a first round interview versus a final round interview?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and I think that the expectations are typically, to get an offer with any consulting firm, you need to do really well. But in the first round, you're kind of group of fellow applicants is different in the second round. And so I like to say, for lack of a better phrase, I like to give my clients kind of a rating out of 10 after the end of a session that we do, just so they know for their own practice. And I like to say kind of a 7 out of 10 will get you past the first round, but to get an offer, you need to be over a 9, consistently. And so if you find yourself having done well in a first round interview or in a phone interview, you should definitely take a lot of confidence and take heart that you're going in the right direction. But in that final round, you're competing against some people who are just as intelligent as you are, with just the same analytical, creative, and quantitative thinking ability, with the same limited number of spots. So you really want to get to the point where you look at case of interviews as fun. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but if you can get to that point where a new business problem sounds like the most fun thing in the world, at least for just a few weeks, you're probably in the right state of mind to get yourself to that 9. That's going to get you the offer that you want.
Perfect. Also, we have a question as well. So how would you recommend someone who have management experience, 20 plus years, to get to the close to the list for the interview? How do you portray that, or how do you leverage your experience to get the interview?
Yeah, and I mean, so this is a great question, and it may depend on a number of different factors. So, what consulting role you're looking at, which firm you're looking at, and whether there is any particular expertise that this firm is looking for. So if for example, if your management experience is in working for defense contractors, then for this consulting firm in this interview, you might want to pitch yourself as having deep industry experience that'll fit with one of their functional or sector practices. And so it's really going to depend on your individual kind of skills and experience, but I think that with consulting, it all comes back to problem solving, leadership, and quantitative ability, and that kind of actually falls under problem solving. So really problem solving and leadership, and if you can pitch yourself in that way, taking into account the unique aspects of the consulting firm that you're looking for, and if you have that much experience, you may even think of looking for an expert kind of role, then you'll be putting your best foot forward.
Okay, great. Also, we have a question from George. So a little more general, but what are the various roles or career levels in consulting organizations, and what is the industry experience for each level?
Yes, that's a great question. So if you're not familiar with the consulting industry, there are typically two kind of, well, let's say 3 entry points that I've seen candidates and clients come into. The first is the post-undergrad entry point. And folks with an undergraduate degree, in some cases like a 1-year master's as well, they'll come directly into a consulting firm at the analyst position. And the analyst position is, just think of that as kind of your first position in a consulting firm on your way to partner. Then you've got something called the associate position. And the terminology kind of varies across consulting firms. Some people say consultant, some people say associate. That's kind of your post-MBA position, or in many cases PhDs or MDs, or in my case I was a JD. They come in at that level. Oftentimes, both the analyst and associate positions last about 2 years on average. Typically, most analysts will go back to business school or some other type of professional school, and in some cases, consulting firms will even sponsor your education, so that's pretty cool if you're at that point. And then you kind of move to the associate level, and the associate level typically lasts about 2 years, moving from associate to senior associate, and finally to the point where you start getting asked to run projects of your own as a junior engagement manager or an engagement manager. Now, the engagement manager role is just a really fascinating role at consulting firms because you're managing, the most intelligent people you can find, and you're trying to keep them happy. You're also trying to keep the client happy, and you're doing your best to keep everyone else who's senior in the firm happy. And so this is, incredible business training if you ever get the chance to do it. Now, moving from the kind of project manager role, there's and not to go too long on this question, but
sure, no, of course, go for it.
there's a rich answer to be shared. Is that you can so you typically see people moving to kind of a pre-partner style role. Again, the title will vary across firms, but think of this as another kind of 2-year training ground. Where you move from project manager to, we'll just call it kind of pre-partner, where you're no longer just managing the project and the problem solving and kind of being that central gear, but you're now moving into more of the thought leadership aspect of a particular case. And so you're trying to drive forward the thinking, but maybe not managing as much on the ground. So some firms call this like the associate principal. We'll just call it a pre-partner. And the final role that you will see at a consulting firm is the partner level. Where after working for a couple of years as an associate principal or a pre-partner, you've proven that you can drive forward your team's thinking. You've also proven that you can develop client relationships and find new business. You'll typically find yourself at a partner position, and this is probably outside my area of expertise since I wasn't a partner, but that's sort of the career progression. And so if you kind of map it out. It takes on average around 8 years or so to, not 8 years, in some cases 6 or 7 years to kind of come in at a post-MBA level and eventually at least come to the stage where you're being considered for partnership.
Gotcha. Actually, somewhat related to that, are there any closely related career options that you considered when applying for management consulting?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, so I was coming out of law school, and so my options were somewhat limited between law firms, working for legal rights foundations, consulting, and there were a few investment banks that came on campus. I was never that interested in investment banking, although I think it's a great career. I just wasn't personally excited about it, and law was also really, really interesting, but I just found management consulting to be the most interesting of all those. And so when I was in law school, I worked really hard to just talk to consulting firms and try to find an internship so that I start to have a little bit of a foot in the door, because I knew I'd be competing against MBA candidates and other people who were just really motivated too. So I did secure an internship, and that kind of helped me kind of get into the industry. But looking back, if there were any other roles that are similar to consulting, I mean, you have internal strategy groups, and a lot of people that I've spoken to and just come across have gone directly from, say, an MBA position into corporate strategy. And you've also got marketing manager and product manager roles, which can be similar in a way in that you're kind of thinking, you're basically like a CEO of a product, and you're trying to think very strategically about how to do things. It's just you won't have as much variety as you see in consulting, but the trade-off is that you get to go a lot deeper.
Gotcha. And probably one of the last questions that we have for tonight is, are there certain firms stronger within particular industries, healthcare or than others?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's definitely going to be strengths and weaknesses across each firm. And coming from McKinsey and sort of knowing McKinsey's strength in the healthcare space, I want to say that McKinsey is the best in healthcare out of all the firms. But to do so would be probably a little bit biased. So you should do your own research as to which firms seem to have stronger practices in particular industry areas. I will say that McKinsey has made a name for itself in the healthcare space. Bain & Company has made a name for itself with private equity firms. BCG is a wonderful firm. There are a number of wonderful firms. You just need to see which firms suit your particular industry expertise the best, or even your industry interest the best.
Gotcha. And one request, actually, could you move on to the next slide where it has your email, Nevin?
Oh, sure.
Because as you answer the questions, actually people actually kept writing in as well. So we still have plenty of questions that Nevin wasn't able to get to. But as you see there, there's his email and website as well. So please feel free to reach out to him, either about the presentation or his services as well. We're very happy, that Nevin was able to take the time to present tonight. And I apologize for not getting through all the questions, but there's still many sitting to be answered. But still, it's been a great webinar, and we've been very happy to have Nevin on here as well. So please also give us feedback in the follow-up survey if you like this format. It's a little bit longer, but it's definitely had a lot of information. So please let us know what you thought about it. So definitely appreciate that.
Thank you much, yeah, and just thank you all so much for coming today. Really appreciate it, and just don't hesitate to ask me any other questions.
Perfect. And we'll send a follow-up email with the survey, Nevin's contact information, and also the webinar recording. So if you actually came in the middle or things like that, you don't worry, you'll get the recording as well. So all right, thank you so much, everybody, and have a fantastic night.
All right, talk to you later, guys.
Bye-bye.